What if everything we thought we knew about that relationship wasn't just complicated, but deeply one-sided in a way that was hiding in plain sight the entire time? Because when you really listen to what's being said now, it doesn't just sound like reflection, it sounds like a quiet confession. For years, this so-called plural marriage was presented as something built on balance, respect, and shared responsibility. A family structure that, while unconventional, was supposed to work because everyone played their part. But now, looking back, that image is starting to crack, and what's underneath it is far more uncomfortable than anyone expected. He openly admits that when he was moving between households, it never really felt like he belonged fully in any of them. Instead, he describes it like he was constantly dropping into lives that were already in motion. Lives that didn't pause for him. Families that had their own rhythm, their own routines, their own sense of stability, until he showed up. And when he did show up, it wasn't always welcomed. That's the part that hits differently. Because instead of describing himself as a central figure holding everything together, he describes himself as an interruption. Someone stepping into spaces where things were already functioning without him. A presence that disrupted more than it supported. And it wasn't just a passing feeling either. It was something that kept happening. Something that became normal. Even Robyn, who many people assumed had the strongest connection with him, would say it outright. That his presence felt like it was breaking into her life, not blending into it. That he wasn't seamlessly part of the structure, he was disrupting it. Think about that for a second. How does a husband become an interruption in his own family? That alone tells you everything about how disconnected things really were behind the scenes. But what makes this even more revealing is that this version of events wasn't fully shown everywhere. In some versions of the show, these admissions were softened or removed entirely, and that changes the entire narrative. Because when those words are left out, the story feels different. It feels less honest, less raw, less real. But when you hear them in full context, it becomes impossible to ignore what's really being said. And that's where things start to shift. Because now, he's in a completely different situation. No more rotating between households. No more stepping in and out. No more escaping tension by simply going somewhere else. Now, he's in one home, one relationship, one constant reality, and suddenly, everything feels heavier. He admits that now, there's accountability in a way that didn't exist before. But not in a vague, surface-level way. In a very specific, uncomfortable way. Back then, problems didn't really reach him. When he would arrive at each home, everything was managed, controlled, softened. The wives would keep things calm, avoid conflict, and create an environment that didn't challenge him too much. Not because everything was perfect, but because they knew they didn't have the space to fully express the hard parts. They made things easier for him. They gave him grace. They adjusted themselves around him, and in doing that, they carried the emotional weight of the relationship, so he didn't have to. Now, that safety net is gone. Now, there's no rotation, no distance, no break from difficult conversations. Now, when something goes wrong, it stays in the room, and he has to deal with it. That's what he calls accountability. But when you really break that down, it reveals something much deeper. Because what he's describing isn't some advanced emotional growth or complex relationship dynamic. It's basic partnership. Listening, being present, handling conflict, supporting someone emotionally. These aren't extraordinary expectations, that they're the foundation of any real relationship. So when someone says they're now being forced to do these things, it raises a serious question. What was happening before? Because if this level of presence feels new, then that means it was missing all along. And that lines up perfectly with what the other wives have been saying for years. That the love they received was conditional, not steady, not equal, not secured. It depended on how they behaved. If they were agreeable, supportive, and easy to be around, things were good. But the moment they pushed back, questioned something, or expressed frustration, everything shifted. The connection would pull away. The warmth would disappear, and suddenly, they were the problem. It creates a pattern where love isn't something you feel, it's something you earn. And that's not loved, that's control. One of the most telling moments comes from something Christine once shared. Being told that she needed to be more lovable. Just think about the weight of that statement. Not let's work on us. Not how can we fix this together. But you need to change, so I can love you. That's not a partnership. That's a condition, and when you connect that mindset to everything else being revealed now, it paints a very clear picture. These weren't equal relationships. They were structured in a way where one person benefited and everyone else adjusted. The wives carried the responsibility of maintaining peace, raising children, managing households, and protecting his comfort, while he moved between spaces, receiving the best version of each environment. And if one space became difficult, there was always another one waiting. But now, there isn't. Now, everything stays, and that's where things become even more interesting. Because the current relationship still shows signs of that same dynamic, just in a different form. There's still a sense that everything works, as long as certain conditions are met, as long as the peace is maintained, as long as the tension is controlled, as long as the roles are followed. And that brings us to something that once sounded like a joke, but now feels like a key piece of the puzzle: the idea of treating him like a best customer. At first, it might come across as playful or harmless, but when you look at it through everything we know now, it starts to feel like a strategy, a way to keep the relationship stable, a way to avoid conflict, a way to ensure that things don't fall apart. Because if the relationship depends on keeping him satisfied, then what happens when that stops? That's the question no one is really answering. And to be fair, there's another layer to this. Because behavior like that doesn't just appear out of nowhere, that it's learned, that it's shaped over time, that it comes from being in an environment where keeping the peace is more important than expressing the truth, where challenging the system comes with consequences, where prioritizing the man isn't just expected, it's required. That kind of conditioning runs deep, and while it doesn't justify everything, it does explain why certain patterns continue, but explanation doesn't remove impact. Because at the same time, there's still responsibility, still choices being made, still a dynamic being reinforced, and according to what's been said, there's also a level of fear in that environment. A need to be careful, to avoid triggering reactions, to keep things calm. Walking on eggshells isn't a sign of a healthy relationship, it's a sign of imbalance. So what we're really looking at now isn't some fairytale ending after years of struggle, it's a shift from one version of imbalance to another. The difference is, this time there's no escape from it, no rotation, no distraction, no way to step out and reset somewhere else. Everything is right there. Constant. Unavoidable. And that's why these recent revelations matter so much. Because they don't just add context. They confirm a pattern where love was tied to compliance, where presence was inconsistent, where emotional responsibility was uneven, and where accountability only became real when there was nowhere left to run. And maybe the most unsettling part of all of this is how simple the truth actually is. If you genuinely care about someone, you don't have to remind yourself to show up for them. You don't have to learn how to listen. You don't have to force yourself to be present. It happens naturally, which means if it feels like effort now, then it was absence before, and that changes everything. So when you step back and look at the bigger picture, the question isn't whether this is surprising, that it's whether it finally confirms what was always there, just hidden beneath the surface. What if everything we thought we understood about that relationship was never the full story? Because the more you listen to what's being revealed now, the harder it becomes to ignore the truth that's been sitting there all along. For years, the idea of plural marriage was presented as something balanced, something structured, something that worked because everyone had a role and everyone respected it. It was framed as a system built on unity, where one man could lead multiple households and still maintain strong, meaningful connections with each of them. But now, that image is starting to fall apart. And it's not because of speculation or outside criticism, it's coming directly from him. He admits that when he was moving between homes, it didn't feel like he was truly part of those lives. Instead, it felt like he was stepping into something that was already complete without him. Each household had its own rhythm, its own routine, its own sense of normal, and when he arrived, it didn't always feel natural. It felt like he was interrupting, not helping, not leading, not supporting, interrupting. And that word carries more weight than it seems. Because an interruption isn't something people look forward to. It's something that breaks the flow, something that disrupts comfort, something that people tolerate rather than embrace. And according to him, that feeling wasn't rare, it was common. That's the part that really changes everything. Because if his presence felt like a disruption in his own family, then what does that say about the connection he actually had with those households? It suggests distance. It suggests disconnect. It suggests that instead of being a central figure holding everything together, he was moving on the outside, stepping in briefly, then disappearing again before anything real could settle. And even more telling, this wasn't just his personal interpretation. It was something that was said to him directly. There were moments where it was made clear that his presence wasn't blending into their lives, it was breaking into them. That the timing didn't feel right. That the energy didn't align. That instead of bringing stability, he was bringing disruption. And when you really think about it, that's not how a healthy relationship works. A partner isn't supposed to feel like a guest, a husband isn't supposed to feel like someone who just drops in and out. But that's exactly how it's being described now. And what makes this even more unsettling is the fact that this version of the story wasn't always fully shown. In some edits, these raw admissions were either softened or completely removed. Which means a lot of people were watching a version of events that didn't include some of the most important details. Because once you hear it in full, the entire narrative shifts. Suddenly, it's not about a complicated family trying to make things work, it's about a structure that may never have worked the way it was claimed to. And that's where things start to get even deeper. Because when he talks about those years, he doesn't just describe physical distance, he describes emotional distance too. He explains that when he would arrive at each home, everything felt managed, controlled, almost curated. The difficult conversations weren't happening in front of him. The tension was being held back. The real struggles were being pushed aside. Instead, what he experienced was a version of each household that had already been adjusted to accommodate him, a calmer version, a softer version, a version that didn't challenge him too much. And at first glance, that might sound like peace, but it wasn't peace. It was pressure. Because maintaining that kind of environment doesn't happen naturally, it takes effort. It takes restraint. It takes choosing not to say things that need to be said. It means holding in frustration. It means managing emotions alone. It means carrying weight that should have been shared. And over time, that creates a gap between what's real and what's being shown, and he benefited from that gap. Because while each household was working to keep things smooth and conflict-free during his visits, he was moving between them without fully experiencing the reality of any of them. He was getting the best version of each situation without dealing with the hardest parts. And that's where the imbalance begins to reveal itself. Because relationships aren't built on curated moments, that they are built on honesty, on conflict, on working through uncomfortable situations together. But if those moments are being hidden, then the connection isn't real, it's controlled. And that kind of control doesn't just affect communication, it affects how love is experienced. Because if someone only sees you when everything is calm, when everything is easy, when everything is adjusted to make them comfortable, then they're not seeing you, they're seeing a version of you that's been edited. And over time, that creates a situation where one person feels supported, while the other feels unseen. And that's exactly the kind of dynamic that starts to surface when you listen closely to what's being said now. Because it wasn't just about time being divided, it was about emotional responsibility being uneven. One side was doing the work to maintain peace. The other side was moving through that peace, without fully understanding what it cost to create it. And once you see that, it becomes impossible to ignore what it leads to, because if one person is always adjusting, always softening, always holding things together, and eventually, something did break. Because a system like that can only hold together for so long before the pressure underneath it starts to rise. First, it probably didn't look obvious. On the surface, everything might have still seemed functional, even stable. But behind that surface, the imbalance was growing. Quietly, gradually, almost invisibly. When one side of a relationship is constantly adjusting, holding back feelings, smoothing over tension, making everything easier for the other person, it doesn't just disappear. It builds, and the moment it starts to come out, everything changes. Because now, instead of calm, there are questions. Instead of silence, there are opinions. Instead of agreement, there's resistance. And that's where things become uncomfortable for someone who's used to everything being easy. He admits that during those years, when he entered each home, he wasn't walking into conflict. He wasn't being challenged directly. He wasn't forced to sit with difficult emotions or unresolved issues. Everything was already handled. But that doesn't mean those issues didn't exist. It just means they weren't being brought to him. And that detail matters more than anything, because when problems aren't shared, they don't get solved. They just get buried, and when they're buried long enough, They don't disappear, they explode. Now think about what happens when those same voices, the ones that stayed quiet for so long, finally start speaking up. Suddenly, the dynamic shifts. Because now, instead of being surrounded by carefully managed peace, he's faced with reality. Raw, unfiltered, and impossible to ignore. And if you're not used to that, it feels overwhelming. It feels unfair. It feels like everything is coming at you all at once. But in reality, it's not muted, it's just finally visible. And this is where the idea of accountability starts to take on a completely different meaning. Because when he talks about being held accountable now, it's not just about being present physically, it's about being present emotionally, it's about staying in the moment when things get uncomfortable instead of stepping away from them. It's about listening when someone is upset, instead of avoiding the conversation entirely, and most importantly, it's about not having an escape, because before, there was always an exit if one conversation got too heavy. There was another house if one relationship became tense. There was another environment waiting if one wife expressed frustration. There were others who would keep things calm. There was always somewhere else to go, and that created a pattern where discomfort wasn't something to work through. It was something to walk away from. But now, that option doesn't exist anymore. Now, when something feels tense, it doesn't just disappear. It stays, it lingers, it demands attention. And that's what makes this shift so significant. Because for the first time, he's experiencing what the others were dealing with all along. The difference is, they didn't have the option to leave. They had to sit with it, they had to process it, they had to manage it on their own, and now, he's being asked to do the same. But instead of seeing it as something normal, something that's part of any real relationship, it's being framed as something new, something difficult, something that requires effort, and that's where things start to feel unsettling. Because what's being described as a challenge now is what should have been there from the beginning. Being present, listening, handling conflict, supporting your partner through difficult moments. These aren't advanced relationship skills, that they're the basics. So when someone says they're now learning to do these things, it forces you to question what the foundation was before, because if the foundation didn't include these elements, then what was it built on? Convenience? Control? Comfort? Because from everything being revealed, it starts to look like the system worked best when everything revolved around keeping him comfortable. When his experience was smooth, when his time in each home felt easy, and the moment that comfort was disrupted, the dynamic shifted, distance would grow, tension would rise, and the connection would weaken. That's not balanced, that's dependency on compliance. And once you see that pattern, it becomes impossible to unsee it. Because it explains so much. That it explains why some voices felt unheard, why certain frustrations kept repeating, why the same issues kept coming up again and again, without resolution, because they were never fully addressed in the first place. They were managed, delayed, avoided, until they couldn't be anymore, and when everything finally started to come out, it probably felt like chaos. Like everything was falling apart all at once. But in reality, it wasn't falling apart. It was revealing what had been there all along. A structure that looked stable, but was never truly equal. A system where emotional responsibility wasn't shared, it was carried by some, and avoided by others, and now, with nowhere left to step away, that imbalance is no longer hidden. It's right there, constant, unavoidable, and impossible to ignore.